Hello, good evening, or good morning, whenever you see this lecture. Hoping you're safe, enjoying your day, and doing great. Uh, if you were talking about political science and democracy in the sense of the progress of the communities and government, it would be proper in a way to see how scholars and thinkers see things. It would be much better to see in the level of theoretical description whether all these progress were appropriate or not. In this lecture and in the coming lecture, in lecture number 10 and 11, I think it would be better if we just have a view or a perspective how thinkers, philosophers started to understand and explain the progress of democracy. Uh, Maybe in the beginning of the semester, you assume that it is a very simple word, democracy. But I think day by day, lecture by lecture, it is so obvious that it is a little ambiguous. I just want to remind you with the old dilemmas we were talking about, the six questions, the questions about whether it is republic or democracy, the dilemma between city and nation, the dilemma between whether it is a representative or centralized, federal or decentralized. All these questions, all these dilemmas used to be the major concerns of all philosophers. The most important point is that not only the philosophers of political science, also sociology, scientists from all sciences were more concerned to understand what is going on inside politics. That's why it would be much better to see how these philosophers understand and explain what happened in the history. Let's talk about the theories in general. We're going to discuss certain philosophers, thinkers, and the core, let's say, people who or thinkers who are the more important thinkers and shaping the literature of political science. To understand more and more that progress and to follow up what we are aiming to do in this lecture, to follow the track of philosophers and thinkers, we might determine the era of these thinkers, because definitely each thinker is affected directly with the structure, the environment, the progress of the community, and the heredity of his mindset. So we might track the democratic ideas since Russell's two roles. These are two important thinkers shaping two separate eras. Proclus used to be one of the most important leaders in Athens, um, and he is one of the most important thinkers of that era. And a funeral orientation in 430 BCE for some of the men who had fallen in the war, the Athenian leader Proclus described democratic Athens as the school of health. Among the city's many exemplary qualities, he declared, was it as constitution which favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. Proclus continued, if we look to the laws, they offered equal justice to all in their private differences. If to social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor again does poverty pair the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by obscurity of his condition. The freedom which was enjoyed in our government extends also to our ordinary life. This particular speech could be explained or could be seen as an explanation to the idea of democracy and the equality actually, and highlighting the value of equality over the classes and the various classification of people. So this quote also reflects the idea how they were asking for highlighting the value of equality. A century later, Aristotle discussed democracy in terms that would become highly influential in comparative studies of political systems. At the heart of his approach is the notion of constitution, which he defines as an organization of offices which all the citizens distribute among themselves according to the power which different classes possess. He concludes that there must therefore be as many forms of, government actually as there are modes of arranging the offices according to the superiorities and differences of the parts of the state. Ever the realist, however, he remarks that the best government is often unattainable, and therefore the true legislation and statesman ought to be acquainted not only with that which is best in the abstract, but also with that which is best relatively in the current circumstances. According to Aristotle, it is to move forward in the practical level to give more spotlight on what they should offer to citizens. Aristotle identifies three kinds of ideal constitution, each of which describes a situation in which those who rule pursue the common good, and three corresponding kinds of perverted constitution, each of which describes a situation in which those who rule pursue narrow and selfish goals. The three kinds of constitution, both ideal and perverted, are differentiated by the number of people or persons they allow to rule. Thus, rule by one is monarchy in its ideal form and tyranny in its perverted form. Rule by the few as aristocratic system in its ideal form and oligarchy in its perverted form, and rule by the many as polity in its ideal form and democracy in its perverted form. He was trying to differentiate or classify certain patterns. He gave like several patterns. He gave the monarchy system. He was talking about the aristocratic system, the oligarchy system. And finally, he was talking about the democratic system. Aristotle's general scheme prevailed for more than 2 millennia, though his unsympathetic and puzzling definition of democracy, which probably didn't reflect the views of most Greeks in his time, didn't. Aristotle himself took a more favorable view of democracy in his studies of the variety, stability, and composition of actual democratic governments. In his observation that the basis of democratic state is liberty, Aristotle proposed a connection between the idea of democracy and the liberty that would be strongly emphasized by all later advocates of democracy. The main idea in this is the linkage, the connection that Aristotle was trying to create between liberty as a value and democracy as an attitude, liberty as a constitutional base and government as offices and institutions. After Aristotle, we need to talk about Locke. Locke also, John Locke is one of the most important, interesting thinkers that we always love to talk about. In early 20th century, after Aristotle, the English philosopher John Locke adopted the essential elements of the Aristotelian classification of constitutional in his second treatise of civil government. Unlike Aristotle, however, Locke was an unequivocal supporter of political equality, individual liberty, democracy, and majority rule. Although his work was naturally rather abstract and not particularly programmatic, it provided a powerful philosophical foundation for much later democratic theories and theorizing and political programs. Locke actually was trying to be more practical, more realistic level. In spite of he depended on Aristotle on much of his work, he's still a little bit changing the spirit of Aristotle theory. Let's talk here about the legitimacy of government. According to Locke, in his hypocritical or the state of nature that precedes the creation of a human series, men live equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection, and they are perfectly free to act and to dispose of their possessors, opinions, perspectives, as they see fit, within these bounds of natural law. From these and other premises, Locke draws the conclusion that political society, for example, insofar as it is legitimate, represents a social contract among those who have consented to make a community or government wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. These two ideas, the consent of the governed and majority rule, became central to all subsequent theories of democracy. Uh, Actually, Locke is one of the most important fathers to the social contract theory, and social contract theory considered as the root of political science in general, and in a way it shadowed the basic roots of democracy itself. For Locke, they are in a way very connected and inextricably connected. Um, the relation between legitimacy and government is very important to him. For if the consent of the majority shall not in reason be received as the act of the whole and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything be the act of the whole. But such a consent is next to impossible ever to be had. Thus, no government is legitimate unless it enjoys the consent of the governed, and that consent cannot be redundant except through majority rule. So, he was trying to explain the relation between what he called democracy la, to the legitimacy and the structure of the government itself. Given these conclusions, it is somewhat surprising that Locke's description of the different forms of democracy, or what he called commonwealth, does not explicitly uh, prescribe democracy as the only legitimate system. Writing in England in the 16th, 19th, a generation after the Commonwealth ended with the restoration of monarchy. Locke was more shocked and circumspect than this. Nevertheless, a careful reading of the relevant passage of the second treatise show that Locke remains true to his fundamental principle that the only legitimate form of government is that based on the consent of the governed. So uh, I just want you to be very aware of that. The only important part of this is that we were trying to attract your attention to one important idea or notion, which is the only reason why a government can be legitimate is the acceptance of the citizens, or what he called the governed. Locke actually differentiates between the various forms of government on the basis of where the people choose to place the power to make laws. His categories are the traditional ones. If the people return the legislative power for themselves, together with the power to appoint those who execute the law, then the form of the government is a perfect democracy. If they put the power into the hands of a few selected men and their heirs of certain successories, then it is an oligarchy, or else into the hand of one man, and then it is a monarchy. Nevertheless, his analysis is far more supervised of non-democratic forms of government than it appears to be. For whatever the form of government, the ultimate source of sovereign power is the people, and the legitimate government must reset on their consent. If he was talking about the source of legitimacy as the people, he started to talk about the separation of power as a further aspect of democracy. He was talking about whether the entire privileges, powers, and authority should be in one hand of one man, in the hand of minority, or shared by as much people as we can. Therefore, if a government abuses its trust and violates the people's fundamental rights, particularly the right to property, the people are entitled to repeal and replace that government with another to whose laws they can willingly give their consent. So, he protected the right of people to replace the government whenever they feel this government is no more capable to protect their rights, or even is a threat to or is threatening their rights, and especially he was talking about the right to property, and who is to judge whether the government has abused its trust. Again, Luke is unequivocal. The people themselves are to make the judgment, although he doesn't use the term. Luke thus um, unambiguously affirms the right of revolution against a despotic government. He was trying to make it legal to rebel against the government. He was trying to make it the basic for the structure of any government, or any community actually, to protect and to have the right to rebel and change the government if people felt this government is not doing their job, or became a threat to people's rights. Less than a century later, Locke's views were echoed in the famous words of the United States Declaration of Independence. Let's see these words and let's see how it was reflected from Locke's words. The Declaration said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." See, this is exactly the word that uh, uh, Luke was talking about Government are instituted among men, and they're just power from the consent of the government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right to people, it is the right of people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is exactly the Declaration of Independence of the United States, and you can see it is totally part of Locke's words. Okay, let's try to answer some of the fundamental questions that we raised in last before three lectures. Although Locke's ideas were radical, even quietly revolutionary, in his time, his answers to question number 1 through 3 um, would need further elaboration and even seem alternative in a way as the theory and practice of democracy continued to develop. Regarding question 1, what is the appropriate association within which a democratic government should be established? Despite the generally of his conclusions, Locke clearly intended them to apply to England as a whole and presumably also to other nation states. Departing from views that still prevailed among political philosophers of his time, Locke held, as the liberals did, that democracy did not require a small political unit, such as a city-state, in which all members of what we call demos could participate in government directly. Here again, Locke was at the forefront of the development of democratic ideas. Regarding question number 2, who should constitute the demos? Locke believed, along with almost everyone else who had expressed an opinion on the issue, that children should not enjoy the full rights of citizens, though he maintained that parents are morally obligated to respect their children's rights as a human being, with almost no substantive arguments. Locke adopted the traditional view that women should be excluded from demos, though he insisted that they retain all other fundamental rights. More than a century would pass before the consent of the people was generally understood to include the consent of women later on. Unlike the men of Athens or the small male aristocracy of Venice, obviously the men of England could not govern directly in an assembly. In this case, then, the answer to question number 3, what political institutions are necessarily for governing, would have to include the use of representatives chosen by people. Yet, though it seems clear that Locke's government by consent requires representation, he provided little guidance as to the form it might take. This is perhaps because he, like his contemporary readers, assumed that democracy and majority rule would be best implemented in England through parliamentary election based on an adult man-male franchise. Uh, Actually, Locke is one of the most important and radical concepts and still ambiguous. While he was talking about human rights and talked about the rights of children, he didn't consider women, for example, are capable to participate in political science. In spite of talking about various patterns of democracy, The idea of majority versus minority and religious minority, for example, was a little bit absent from his perspective. But no one can deny actually that Locke is one of the most important thinkers that affect the track of democracy. His thoughts is the root of a lot of other philosophers, thinkers, and explanation of democratic and political science in general. The idea of the social contract is one of the most important, let's say, theories on political science. Thank you so much for joining me in this session. Hoping you have good weekend. Enjoy your weekend. Once I'm recording this on Thursday, so I don't know when you're gonna see it. But in all cases, wish you all the best and be safe. Bye.